Good afternoon and welcome to Lunch Break Live with Tea Party Patriots Action. I'm Bill Pasco, Tea Party Patriots man in Washington, and I am flying solo this week. I'll be delivering both the Washington report and the call to action. Let's get right to it. The House and Senate will both return today. The House will stay in session through Thursday. The Senate is scheduled to stay in session through Friday. We'll see. Last week in the House came back to work on Monday and took up and passed two bills under suspension of the rules. On Tuesday, the House passed a bill under suspension, then took up and passed a rule governing floor consideration of three resolutions. The House took off Wednesday, so members could fly to Arizona to attend the funeral of Raul Grijalva, who died on March 13. The House came back into session on Thursday and passed the two CRA resolutions of disapproval. Then the House took up and passed H.R. 1048, the Deterrent Act. And then they were done. This week in the House will return today with the first vote set for 6:30 p.m. At that time, the House is scheduled to consider 7 bills under suspension of the rules. On Tuesday, and for the balance of the week, the House is scheduled to consider 4 bills pursuant to a rule. They are H.R. 1526, the Rogue Rulings Act, S.J. Res. 18, a joint resolution disapproving the rules submitted by the Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection relating to overdraft lending, very large financial institutions, S.J. Res. 28, a joint resolution disapproving the rules submitted by the Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection relating to defining larger participants of a market for general use digital consumer payment applications. And finally, H.R. 22, the SAVE Act, which requires that state election officials obtain documentary proof of U.S. citizenship before registering someone to vote. Last week in the Senate came back to work on Monday and began processing nominations. Because of an agreement reached between the two parties many years ago, only the senior-most presidential appointees require no less than 30 hours of debate after cloture has been invoked, that is, after debate has been ended. The vast majority of a president's appointees are now confirmed after just 2 hours of debate. Consequently, the Senate can process the lower-level appointees much quicker. The Senate confirmed the last of the 30-hour nominations a few weeks ago, so it's now processing confirmations much faster. So, at the start of the week, the Senate confirmed the following people to the following positions: John Phelan to be Secretary of the Navy, Christopher Landau to be Deputy Secretary of State, Michael Kratsios to be Director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, Jay Bhattacharya to be Director of the National Institutes of Health, Martin McCary to be Commissioner of Food and Drugs, Dan Bishop to be Deputy Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Aaron Reitz to be an Assistant Attorney General, and Michael Falkender to be Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. Then, after moving nominations on Tuesday and Wednesday, the Senate began taking up Congressional Review Act resolutions of disapproval. First up was the motion to proceed to H.J. Res. 25, a CRA resolution of disapproval of the rules submitted by the Internal Revenue Service relating to gross proceeds reporting by brokers that regularly provide services effectuating digital asset sales. Precisely 2 hours after the motion to proceed was agreed to, the bill itself passed by the same 70 to 28 vote. Then the Senate took up the motion to proceed to S.J. Res. 18, a joint resolution disapproving the rules submitted by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau relating to overdraft lending, very large financial institutions. On Thursday, the Senate passed the resolution. Then the Senate took up and passed the motion to end debate on the nomination of Paul Lawrence to be Deputy Secretary of Veterans Affairs, and 2 hours after the motion to end debate passed, the nomination was confirmed, and then they were done. This week in the Senate will return on Monday with the first vote set for 5:30 p.m. At that time, the Senate will proceed to a roll call vote on the motion to end debate on the nomination of Matthew Whitaker to serve as United States Permanent Representative on the Council of NATO. In addition, the Senate may take action on a budget resolution as soon as Wednesday. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Now let's talk about Liberation Day. On Wednesday, if all goes as planned, the United States will impose what President Trump has taken to calling fair and reciprocal tariffs on products imported into the United States from almost 200 countries around the world. As late as Sunday, I could not find a definitive guide to what the tariff levels will be, or which products from which countries will be affected. The best I could come up with was a declaration by President Trump on Sunday to reporters flying with him on Air Force One that, and I quote, "You'd start with all countries, essentially all of the countries that we're talking about," end quote. This would seem to countermand what we heard a few days ago from Kevin Hassett, the director of the National Economic Council, who told Fox Business that the administration's tariff focus would be on the 10 to 15 countries with the worst trade imbalances, essentially the bottom 15% of our trade partners, which account for almost 90% of our imports. One thing we do know for sure is this. President Trump said Saturday that he, quote, couldn't care less, unquote, if foreign cars cost more because of his new tariffs. Asked what he said recently to auto industry CEOs and whether he had warned them against raising prices, he said, quote, "The message is congratulations. If you make your car in the United States, you're going to make a lot of money. If you don't, you're going to have to probably come to the United States. Because if you make your cars in the United States, there is no tariff," end quote. When pressed if he had told them not to raise prices, Trump responded, quote, "No, I never said that. I couldn't care less if they raise prices because people are going to start buying American-made cars," end quote. So all I can say at this point is stay tuned. Wednesday will be interesting. Now let's talk about the reconciliation process. House and Senate Republican leaders are making progress in their conversations over the reconciliation bill. So much progress, in fact, that Senate Republicans may actually take up a budget resolution this week, perhaps even as early as Wednesday. The holdup is that they haven't yet had their definitive meeting with the Senate parliamentarian, from whom they need an assurance that their plan to use the current policy baseline as the premise for their budget plan is okay by her. She's the arbiter of what flies in a reconciliation bill. And this decision is a key to the whole enterprise. Essentially, if she says yes, they can use the current policy baseline. Then they can write a bill that changes the tax law beginning next year without having to, quote unquote, pay for their tax cuts. The Senate Republican leadership has apparently decided to agree to the House's desire to include a debt limit increase in the reconciliation bill. They've set the figure at $5 trillion, according to news reports, so that will be included in this new budget resolution. Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana explained the reason behind moving the budget resolution sooner rather than later in his brilliantly eloquent fashion. Quote, "The sight of the gallows concentrates the mind. You've just got to make people vote," he said. "I don't think anybody is going to vote against it, except one or two, maybe." The Senate budget resolution is expected to instruct 3 Senate committees to each find at least $1 billion in savings, for a total of $3 billion, while it instructs House committees to find savings much closer to what the House budget resolution called for, which was a minimum of $2 trillion in savings, including instructing the Energy and Commerce Committee to find $880 billion in savings, which everyone assumes means Medicaid will have to bear the brunt of an awful lot of savings. As happened a few weeks ago, when the Senate took up its first budget resolution, there will be a vote-a-rama, where any senator can offer any amendment he or she wants in an all-night escapade. If the Senate passes a budget resolution this week, the House will take it up as soon as Speaker Johnson and his leadership team determine that they've got the votes to pass it. Now let's talk about President Trump's executive order on election integrity. On Tuesday, President Trump signed an executive order requiring people to provide documentary proof that they are citizens before registering to vote. directing the Election Assistance Commission to amend its National Mail Voter Registration Form to include such a requirement. The executive order also directs the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of State to make available to state governments their databases, so that state and local government officials can verify citizenship or immigration status of voters to make sure they're eligible to register to vote. Within 90 days, the Secretary of Homeland Security is directed to provide the Attorney General information on all foreign nationals who have indicated on any immigration form that they have registered or voted in a federal, state, or local election. Further, the executive order directs that the Election Assistance Commission is directed to cease providing federal funds to states that do not comply with certain federal laws, including one that requires that states accept and use the National Mail Voter Registration Form issued by the Election Assistance Commission, including any requirement for documentary proof of U.S. citizenship. Now the latest on the Iran nuclear deal. The Associated Press reported last night that Iran's president said yesterday that the Islamic Republic rejected direct negotiations with the United States over its rapidly advancing nuclear program. The Iranian president left open the possibility of indirect negotiation, however. Now let's talk about the Signal chat. It takes a lot to keep a news story going for a week. In fact, it's very rare these days that a news story can stay fresh for more than a few hours, let alone a few days, with the velocity of news in the era of social media. But that's what we witnessed last week after The Atlantic reported on Monday that the Trump administration's senior national security officials had formed a Signal chat group to discuss a military operation against the Houthi rebels terrorizing shipping in the Red Sea, and had inadvertently added a journalist to the group discussion, and then shared what appeared to be classified information. Signal is a commercially available text messaging app that bills itself as offering end-to-end encryption. So even if a phone is hacked, the messages contained in a Signal thread are indecipherable. President Trump was reported to be upset with his national security advisor, Mike Waltz, for having mistakenly invited the journalist, Atlantic editor Jeffrey Goldberg, into the chat. Interestingly, not because of the mistake itself, but because in order to mistakenly invite Goldberg into the chat, Waltz had to have Goldberg's contact information already stored in his phone's contacts list. And that was evidence that the two had previously been in contact. The administration pushed back hard, denying that any classified information had been shared in the chat. On Tuesday morning, CIA Director John Ratcliffe and Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard appeared before the Senate Intelligence Committee for their previously scheduled annual Global Threat Assessment hearing. They were asked about the chat and the information shared in the chat, and they both denied that any classified information was shared, and they both said they could not recall many specific aspects of the conversation. The two repeated their denials on Wednesday morning when they appeared before the House Intelligence Committee for the House version of the annual Global Threat Assessment. After more than a day of denials, Goldberg released more information that he had originally withheld. He released what he called the war plans that had been shared by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth to the group 2 hours before the first Houthi targets were hit. The information Hegseth shared with the group included launch times, weapons packages, and targets. And when defense and national security officials from previous administrations were asked to comment on whether or not the information should have been classified, all agreed that it was precisely the kind of information that should not be shared with the public. By Wednesday evening, according to the Wall Street Journal, Trump was considering firing Waltz. He was advised to do so by Vice President J.D. Vance, Chief of Staff Susie Wiles, and Head of Presidential Personnel Sergio Gore. Trump met with Waltz the following day and decided that, as upset as he was with Waltz, he would keep him in place. Not because he didn't think Waltz made a mistake, but because he did not want to give the left a scalp. Trump has been reported to have believed he erred early in his first term when, as a newly installed president, he believes he was railroaded into accepting the forced resignation of his first national security advisor, General Michael Flynn. Trump did not want to send a message that he could be rolled. So Waltz keeps his job, at least for now. Senate Armed Services Committee Chairman Roger Wicker of Mississippi has asked the Department of Defense Inspector General to conduct an investigation of the episode. Attorney General Pam Bondi has said she does not believe there is a need for any investigation. Now to more Republicans. The current count in the House is 218 Republicans and 213 Democrats with 4 vacancies. 2 of the vacancies will be filled this week, when the victors of 2 special elections taking place tomorrow in Florida are determined. The 2 vacancies in Florida are the vacancies created by the departure of Mike Waltz to serve as President Trump's national security advisor, and Matt Gaetz, who was originally slated to serve as Trump's attorney general, but who backed out before going through the confirmation process. Assuming the 2 seats stay Republican, that would bring the count to 220 Republicans and 213 Democrats, with 2 vacancies, with the 2 vacancies in seats previously held by Democrats. On a related front, there will not be a special election to fill a vacancy in New York created by the departure of Congresswoman Elise Stefanik to serve as President Trump's ambassador to the United Nations, because she is not leaving to become ambassador to the United Nations. The administration is worried about Speaker Johnson's ability to move legislation through the House and didn't want to remove another vote from his conference. It probably would have been better for all involved if they had thought of that before announcing their intent to nominate her, but it is what it is. And now to the Jenny Beth Show. Episode 113 of the Jenny Beth Show dropped last Wednesday, featuring Jenny Beth's discussion with Ken Cribb, who worked for 8 years in the administration of Ronald Reagan. If you don't know who Ken Cribb is, you should. The 2 talk about the secrets to Ronald Reagan's success, tax cuts, and Cold War strategy, and how President Trump's presidency echoes President Reagan's. Highly recommended. And that's our Washington report for this week. Now to the call to action. The Senate may be taking up the reconciliation bill, or the reconciliation resolution, that will prevent the biggest tax increase in American history. Democrats in Congress don't want you to have your taxes stay low. The liberal media doesn't want you to know that at the end of the year, if nothing happens before then, the biggest increase in American history is going to take place. So they're not talking about it. That shouldn't surprise anyone. The truth is, there's a clock ticking, and if Congress doesn't pass legislation to prevent it, the biggest tax increase in American history will take effect on January 1, 2026. That's less than 10 months from now. Coordinating with President Trump, Republicans in the House and Senate are working at this very moment to craft legislation to prevent a massive tax hike on more than 60% of American households. They need our help. They need to know they have the support of the American people. The time to act is now. So go to our Take Action page on our website at teapartypatriots.org and sign our petition to tell your elected officials to pass legislation preventing the Democrats' massive tax increase before it's too late. Tell them you do not want to pay more in taxes. By filling out the form on this page, you will sign the petition demanding that Congress prevent a massive tax increase on everyday Americans. You will email a pre-written email directly to your members of Congress urging them to act. You will connect with your members of Congress by phone to voice your support for this work to prevent a massive tax hike. Tell your elected officials it's time to work together to put Americans first and prevent a massive tax increase. Americans simply can't afford higher taxes. That's our broadcast for this week. Thanks for tuning in, and please share this broadcast with your friends on Facebook. As always, if you want to reach out to us, just send an email to jenny.beth@teapartypatriots.org. That's jenny.beth@teapartypatriots.org. And if you want me to answer a question live on air, just put "for broadcast" in the subject line. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be back next week, same time, same place. Until then, be well and be active.